Alrighty, good day, folks. Welcome. We're going to talk a little bit about development while I am currently out of town. A mystery voice because you're not seeing me. In the immortal words of John Cena, you can't see me. And you can't see me because I want to make sure that you're getting the most possible of the screen here. So, let's get right into it. Development. You guys have been reading a lot about development. We haven't had a chance to talk about it in class much because we've been focused on our review, but right now we're going to get development squared away. So you're going to need everything, you are going to get everything you need to know. It'll make it a little bit more easier for you. Bottom line here, folks, is that when we're looking at development, we are looking at the fact that the world is being developed into a well-developed core and a less developed periphery. When we talk about the core, we're talking about the area of the world where there's more developed countries. So we're talking about the areas of North America, Europe. Those are your core areas. And on the outside of that, you have a periphery or the outside. If you think about your peripheral vision, it's on the outside. It's your outside vision. It's not your direct vision. That's the same thing around here, that there's a well-developed core, but on the outside of that, you see a periphery. Much like other models we've been talking about, a core can be a large area like the world, so a core, your more developed countries, or you can have a more developed area of a region. For example, maybe in Northern Virginia, for example. If you look at a core in Virginia, Northern Virginia is the core, and the periphery is the less developed rural areas of the country. So this model is called the core periphery model. Core periphery model. Well-developed core, and the outside you have the periphery. All right. When we're looking at development, there's a couple different ways that we can look at development. One of the ways that a lot of people look at development is by looking at the gross domestic product. The gross domestic product is an economic indicator of development. You're looking at the value of the total output of goods and services produced in a country during a year. It's very, very easy. All you do is you take all the things you produce, tally that up, and boom, that's gross domestic product. But think about it. I don't have a gross domestic product. I can't put a value on you children, you students. Instead, what they do is they view my salary as a teacher being a part of that. That is what we call the service right over here. The service are goods, are products that cannot be measured. We can measure how many chairs we produce. We can measure how many tables we produce. We can't measure how many fires are put out or how many mines are molded. We can't look at that. So we look for services instead as a way to describe that. So gross domestic product, total output of goods and services produced in the country during a given year. Gross domestic product is good at telling us what type of material wealth that we have. If we have a very expensive country producing or a very poor country producing. It also tells us the number of countries that are below the poverty line. It also tells us where things are. Where are those goods and where are those not goods? Here's what gross domestic product does not do a very good job at, and that is it does not do a good job looking at where wealth is. So this idea of distribution of wealth within a country. Now, gross domestic product is a fine factor, but how would LeBron James, for example, feel if I said the average person in America makes $48,000 a year? Well, if you're LeBron James, that is not good because you're making $48,000 probably every game or every quarter or every half quarter or whatever it is. But if you talk to a homeless person on the street in DC, $48,000 for them, that's a heck of a lot of money. So gross domestic product does not do a good job at finding where the wealth is within that country. Does not do a good job. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in general, this whole Human Development Index here in a second. But for right now, when you're looking at per capita GDP, if you have a country that's making more than $20,000 per person, you're a more developed country. If you have per capita GDP where it's less than $1,000 per person, that's not very good. We're talking more about this HDI thing here in a second. So there are 3 jobs that you can have in any country. You can have a primary sector job, which is a agricultural job, a mining job. These are jobs where you are extracting materials directly from the earth. So these are jobs where you are working very directly with the earth. You're a miner, you're a farmer, you're a fisherman, you work with forestry. 75% of workers in less developed countries perform this type of work mainly because they want to produce enough food to survive. Most of those people are farmers. We talked about that in our agriculture unit. But in more developed countries, machines do a lot of the work. So machines do the mining, machines do the fishing, machines do the forestry. We don't have to do that stuff. So this is a big difference when you look at more developed countries and less developed countries. Less developed countries are going to have primary sector jobs, jobs where people are working in and with the earth. Secondary sector jobs are jobs where you're starting to transition to a more developed country. These are jobs where you're transforming raw materials into usable ones, or put it another way, manufacturing jobs. These are your manufacturing jobs. These are your jobs where you're making things. You are producing something tangible that you can manipulate, something that you can make, all those types of things. A tertiary sector job is what more developed countries have. More developed countries are seeing an increase in this type of labor because better technology allows less people to produce more. So you don't need people working on the factory lines because machines do that. You don't need people mining because machines do that. So instead, they're doing jobs that are tertiary sector, or jobs where you are providing goods and services to people. Doctors are a tertiary sector job. Policemen are a tertiary sector job. Anything that does not have a job that you make something or you're growing something is a tertiary sector job. We talked about this already throughout the course of the year, I believe, when we were talking about the idea of cities and urban land use. So refer back to that. Productivity. Productivity is the measure by taking the value of good minus the cost of labor to make it. Value added equals gross value minus the cost of raw materials. This you really don't have to worry about. All this says, of course, is that we are, more developed countries are producing better because we are taking the value of the good, which is higher in more developed countries, and the cost of our labor is lower. So the value added is what the worker provides, and workers are more productive in more developed countries because they have the machines that do that job for them. Your first industrial revolution, the United Kingdom. You guys know this because you took World History 2, you took World History 1, you took US history. You know that the United Kingdom is where industry gets its start. This is where the Industrial Revolution gets its base. But they're a good model to follow because the United Kingdom, for example, they first developed on their own raw materials. They developed their own raw materials. And then what happens with developing their own raw materials is they eventually run out of them. They're an island, of course, so they can't expand outside of that from a growing perspective. So they then established colonies like us, where we in America grew our products and then sent it back to the United Kingdom. This practice retarded the development of those colonies or slowed the progress and the development of those colonies. So for example, when you're talking about colonies, remember, are made in order to help the mother country with raw materials. Today, we don't have colonies, or the United Kingdom doesn't have colonies, so instead they purchase things from less developed countries who in return import the finished product. Some less developed countries can develop if they possess a valuable raw material, which we'll get to later on in this presentation. Now, consumer goods. Consumer goods are extremely important when you're talking about how wealthy a country is. The quantity and type of goods and services purchased in a society indicates the level of development that they have. So take a look at these three consumer goods that we know very well in our country. Motor vehicles, telephones, televisions. These are all things that in our more developed country of America, the vast majority of people own more than one of these things. Motor vehicles, for example, your family might have 2 or 3 motor vehicles. Telephones, forget about it. All of your parents have a cell phone. You have a cell phone. Maybe you have a house phone. And what about televisions? Some of you, I remember talking about, have 4, 5, 6 televisions for 3 people in your house. Those are examples of consumer goods that we ourselves can afford to buy. In less developed countries, you might have 1 television for 1 family. Or in even less developed countries, you might have 1 television in a neighborhood. Or you might have 1 car for an entire family. Or 1 car for a for a couple of different families to share. So these consumer goods, if you can buy a lot of these consumer goods and consumer goods in general, like computers and electronics, you're doing pretty well. If you don't have access to it, that's not good, and you're probably a less developed country. Now, there are more ways to look at development besides just looking at the economic side. A lot of people always focus on the economic side, but there's more to it than just that. It's also social indicators as well. Education is a great example of looking at how developed some places are. Some places spend a greater percentage of their money on education. MDCs spend more, but LDCs spend a little bit greater of a percentage. Now, when you're talking about education, you're talking about things like the student to teacher ratio. In more developed countries like us, we might have 30 students per one teacher. In less developed countries, it might be 60 or 70 students per one teacher. Literacy rate, you're going to have almost 100% in many more developed countries, 97, 96%. Less developed countries, maybe you're in the 80s or 70s. Number of school years attended, obviously more developed countries, going to be higher than less developed countries with our compulsory school education. We also look at health and welfare, where you look at the people to hospital and doctor ratio. In more developed countries, you have a much lower ratio of people that are having access to hospitals and doctors. In less developed countries, you might have one or two hospitals in an entire country. Think about Northern Virginia. We have 3 hospitals within 15 miles of one another. That's a great example of how the United States is more developed. Welfare assistance, for example, government support, all those types of things go into looking at social indicators. Finally, we have the demographic indicators of development. Demographic indicators of development are when you're looking at things like how long people are living, the life expectancy, obviously higher in more developed countries. You're looking at the infant mortality rate, greater in less developed countries. You're looking at the natural increase rate, greater in less developed countries. Crude birth rate, higher in less developed countries. So all of these things point to the fact that people are living longer in more developed countries. They're not dying at a young age. They're not as many population explosion. And the crude birth rate is lower in more developed countries. Now, what is not an indicator of development is this right over here, the crude death rate. The crude death rate is not an indicator of development because remember, from way back with population migration, crude death rate is the amount of people that are dying in a country. Well, old people die, and we don't want to fault the fact that we have a very advanced medical society which allows people to live to a longer age. So we don't want to fault those people for living and then dying. So more developed countries actually have a higher crude death rate because we have more elderly people. And we don't want to fault countries that have a good healthcare system for keeping people alive that eventually die. We don't want to put them at fault for that. So that's why we don't have that. Now, where are these more developed and less developed countries? Well, obviously, this is what we'd expect, so we're going to go pretty quick through this. Most of your more developed regions in the world are situated north of the equator. They consist of 5 major areas: Anglo-America, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Japan, and the South Pacific. And we're going to go over some of these really, really quick. So you're looking at Anglo-America. The language and religious patterns are less diverse in Anglo-America than any other world regions. English primarily is the one that's spoken. Protestant. You don't have the European areas where there's a lot of diversity of languages and a lot of diversity of religions. In Anglo-America, that's the United States and Canada, you don't see a lot of differences. We have basically 2 languages that are spoken, and we basically have 2 religions, and that's it. And they're not in conflict. We also have a very high level of cultural homogeneity. What does that mean? We don't have a lot of mixing of our population. For all the immigrants we have in our country, we don't have borders that are so open. There's all this mixing going on. So cultural homogeneity is very similar at this time where people are very much the same. We export a lot of food, we export a lot of information, and we export a lot of entertainment. That's our thing that we do. Western Europe is distinguished from Anglo-America in the sense that they import raw materials. This is very different from America. America exports raw materials. Europe has to import raw materials. This is why the EU makes so much sense in this area of the world, because if all those countries are importing goods, then they might as well work together. Remember, we talked about this like the Costco method. Europe has to import so much. Why don't they act together, get it at a cheaper rate, buy in bulk? And that's what they do. So Western Europe exports more of a finished product. So the elimination of most economic barriers within the EU makes Western Europe potentially the world's largest and richest market. Thanks to the EU, Europe as a whole, when you look at the Western Europe as a whole, they are actually more wealthy than the United States is, but it's only when they are together. And we have talked about some of the issues they have working together today. So that's an example of that. Our third one, Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe has a lot of raw materials. They have abundant reserves of raw materials. But the problem with Eastern Europe is under communism, they actually went away from consumer goods. So they actually went backwards a little bit in their Human Development Index. Remember, Human Development Index is all about those economic factors, those social factors, those demographic factors. So let me go back here for 1 second. I'll get back to where I was. So when you're looking at this right over here, the economic conditions, the social factors, demographic factors, all of these go in to make a really complex system, and you want to get 1. HDI of 1 is the gold standard. If you can get to 1, that means you're doing really, really well. No country on earth is a 1. The closest we get is Norway with like a 0.96. Other than that, you're all below a 1. Is the system perfect? No, but it's created by the United Nations, and it's about as good as it gets. So going back to where we were over here, Western Europe doing a lot of good stuff. Eastern Europe actually kind of was a little bit higher and then went back, and it's because they didn't focus on consumer goods. Consumer goods are important because people can't eat missiles. They can't buy tanks. They want their homemade goods. They want consumer goods, and they were denied that under communism, and that was a major problem for them. Japan, the South Pacific. Japan, the South Pacific, their economy is taking advantage of something they have a lot of, and that is labor. And they're willing to work, and they're willing to work for very low pay. So Japan is growing economically because of that. Australia and New Zealand are 2 areas in the South Pacific that have HDIs that are comparable to more developed countries. So they kind of follow, they kind of go against the rule. They go against the grain, where most of the time it's your less developed countries that are going to do well. Most of the time it's your less developed countries that are below the equator. These 2 are below the equator, but above in the more developed country realm. Your less developed regions exist primarily in the south, as we talked about, and it consists of 6 regions. The best possible answer to who will be the next highest more developed area is Latin America. Latin America is seeing a growth in people that are living in the cities, and we saw this when we looked at our cities and urban land use. Continued growth of the cities in Latin America. Other people live in rural areas in less developed countries, not in Latin America. They have a very high level of development along the agricultural producing South Atlantic coast. So they're exporting things like beef, and they're exporting raw materials like that. The downside of Latin America, what's keeping them from reaching a higher form of development, is the fact that they are not very equal in their distribution. The distribution of goods in Latin America is not equal. And that's part of a problem, because you have the highest of the highs that are making a lot of money, but the lowest of the lows are very, very poor. So there's a very wide gap, and that's keeping Latin America from being developed. East Asia, this is where we're talking about areas like Korea and China, for example. The communist takeover in China meant that the government took control of most of the agricultural land. Goods were distributed to each family according to their individual needs, and farmers received orders to grow specific crops and specific amounts to grow. While that sounds all well and good, what this caused, though, was a slow development of China, because they were not able to really produce what they should have produced in terms of their money. So that became a pretty big issue for them in terms of producing as much as they possibly could. They needed to kind of break down and open up their borders for them to produce a little bit. Southeast Asia is one of your lowest prospects for development because they really have an inhospitable environment, as you see here. They depend far too much on monsoons for farming practices, and it's just a very difficult geographic terrain. It's one of those examples of where geography sometimes defines and can be a curse for some people. And for the people of Southeast Asia, this is one of those factors that they have. It's kind of a curse for them. So Southeast Asia, low prospects for development. The Middle East, they got a really valuable commodity, and that's being the petroleum reserves in the area. But the downside is that not all the Middle East has oil. The gross exaggeration, of course, is that, oh gosh, everybody in the Middle East has oil. That is not the case. It's only the Persian Gulf states that have oil. The other countries do not, and they have an inhospitable environment. So really, you're depending on the Persian Gulf areas to do better. The least prospect for development, unfortunately, is Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is stuck with kind of a triple whammy. They don't have a lot of great leadership there, a lot of infighting, so they really can't work together. They're very much in need of like a European Union style for Africa. They do have an African Union, but it's not nearly as strong as it could be, and that really affects their development. So poor leadership is a problem. The colonial legacy means that in many cases they're tied very closely to more developed countries that are sometimes looking out for their interests and not the region's interests. So that can be a problem as well. And finally, it's the poor capacity of land to produce food. A lot of areas in Africa are inhospitable in terms of growing food, and so it's very, very difficult for them to kind of get out of the gates. So Sub-Saharan Africa, unfortunately, not a great prospect for development. They are sure to be there at some point in time, hopefully soon, but for right now, it is just not the case. So we talked about this a little bit already. We talked about gender, but much like there's a human development index where you're looking at countries to get to 1, for example, gender development index is looking at the gender equality. Gender inequality exists in every country in the world. There's the Gender Development Index, or the GDI. The GDI measures the access that women have to things like economics, like education and literacy, their life expectancy. That goes into looking at the Gender Development Index. Most of the time, countries are going to see a Gender Development Index that is lower than the Human Development Index, but the lowest by far is this thing. It's called the GEM, or the Gender Empowerment Measure. The Gender Empowerment Measure is when you are looking at when you're looking at a female's ability to decide things. For example, how many women do you have in political leadership positions? How many women do you have in managerial positions in business? How many executives do you have that are women? This gender empowerment measure is very, very low in many, many countries because women are not considered equal to men in most countries. So you see that happen, but you have the Gender Development Index and the Gender Empowerment Measure. All right, so how do you get developed? That's the key question that I want to look at now. How do you get developed? How does one go from less developed to more developed? Well, the first way you can get developed is what I like to call the well-rounded approach. This is your high school approach. This is what your guidance counselor and your parents tell you, that you need to be a well-rounded human being, Johnny. You need to be a balanced growth person. You need to develop everything. You need to be a band star, a sports star, a Girl Scout, an accomplished linguist that speaks several different languages, and you are trying to become a beautifully well-rounded person. Well, countries that do that are doing what's called the self-sufficiency approach. And what does that mean? They are doing it all on their own. They're going to develop their own agriculture, their own industry, their own services. And what they do is they place very high taxes on imports to protect native businesses. They set quotas to limit the number of imports, so you can't buy things from China or buy things from Europe. And they say we're going to have a license that also limits the number of importers. This is called the self-sufficiency approach. Try to be great at everything. Well, you know what, folks? When you try to be great at everything, you know what you're actually great at? You're great at nothing. And the self-sufficiency approach usually fails when it comes to countries. Why? Because it becomes extremely inefficient and there's a very large bureaucracy that happens. And what happens is by trying to be good at everything, you're actually good at nothing. And by being good at nothing, you're not able to develop very well. Most countries that try self-sufficiency switch out of self-sufficiency and go to something called the Rostow model. The Rostow model is what I like to call, and if you're in class right now, go ahead and look up in the ceiling and you'll see that big picture of LeBron James. That's what we call the LeBrostow model, the LeBron James model. Here's what I mean by that. The Rostow model is sometimes called the international trade approach. Here's what I mean by that. LeBron James. Do you think LeBron James is a well-rounded individual? Do you think that LeBron James, when he's done shooting the rock, he goes and reads Shakespeare, performs on his cello, puts out some rhymes on his rap albums, goes and plays golf, then goes to teach orphaned children during his free time? You think that's what LeBron does? No, LeBron doesn't do that. You know what LeBron does? Basketball. You know what else LeBron does? Basketball. You know what else he does? Basketball. The international trade approach, or the Rostow model, says this: pick something you are good at and carry that as far as it can take you. Essentially, put your eggs in one basket. Peyton Manning, I'm sure, is not a well-rounded individual. He's a funny guy and a great football player, no doubt, but I don't think he's a well-rounded individual. LeBron James, not a well-rounded individual. Here's what the international trade approach says. The international trade approach says is most countries start off as a traditional society. They're kind of doing their thing. They're maybe doing some farming, so on and so forth. Then you have the second level over here. And the second level is called the preconditions for takeoff. And this means you find something you are good at. You may find oil and you say, oh my gosh, we found oil. We are going to try and do the most we can with oil. Then you go to takeoff, where you have rapid growth by focusing your efforts on one or two things. So you're looking at oil, so you're looking at the best way you can get oil produced for the cheapest way, for the best way. And then what do? You export that good. You export that oil. Then you have what's called the drive to maturity, in which the money you're making from growing this oil to be so great and so perfect, you are using it to develop other areas. So you start off with this oil, but by getting all this oil, then you can build cities. Then you can build factories. Then you can build other things. And then finally, once that happens, you then shift from an economy that is production to an economy that is consumer. You're going from manufacturing to consumer goods. You're using the one thing that you do better than anybody else, your comparative advantage. You're doing the one thing you do better than anybody else, and you use that to grow your economy by trading it, by getting money, by then investing in other areas of your country. And then you have the age of mass consumption. The international trade approach is again called the Rostow model, what I call the LeBrostow model. You're choosing one thing, doing it to its max, using that money to become a better developed area. A couple examples of the trade approach you should be aware of. Petroleum, for example, or gas or oil. The Persian rich states, the rich Persian Gulf states use, of course, oil. Look at an area like Dubai that's used oil to make cities and islands and malls and all this great stuff, all because of oil. That's something that you see over there. The four Asian dragons of Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, they have used another thing they have, and that is cheap labor. So they've used that to make goods cheaper and cheaper. So they've used labor as a resource. Hey, bring your goods to our country, they say. We'll make your goods as cheap as humanly possible. And once you make your goods as cheap as humanly possible, we can make then that money we're getting from those companies to make our own stuff. And that is the example of the Rostow model, or the Rostow model as I call it. Now, it's not perfect. I'm not telling you it is. It's just a theory. Here's the problem with the Rostow model / the international trade approach. There's a possibility that if you do this and your one thing that you promote doesn't work, you are out of luck. Uneven resource distribution. Price, if the leading commodity does not rise rapidly, if you choose oil and everyone goes wind power, you're done. You got to find something else. Market stagnation. What if people don't want your good? What if it grows slower than anticipated? It's going to take you longer to get money. And in many cases, less developed countries, when they do this international trade approach, sometimes they are forced to buy commodities from MDCs, and they are stuck being dependent on MDCs with paying back salaries that take a long, long time. Despite all of this, the international trade approach, the Rostow model, is the way countries go. India, for example, is a great example of they were about 4% under self-sufficiency. They switched to international trade, customer service, consumer support. Boom, they're at GDP 7%. That is amazingly big. We're growing at a GDP right now of just shy of 2, and they were at 7 for a couple of years. That is a boatload of money. International trade's the way to go. So go home and tell your parents when they're telling you you need to get back to gaming or you need to get back to homework, quit your gaming. So no, mom, dad, I'm going to become a world famous video gamer by using the international trade approach. Rostow, mom, dad, look it up. Now, one of the biggest problems that LDCs have is financing this development. LDCs generally must obtain funds from more developed countries. It's either loans from banks or other international organizations. It's direct investments by transnational organizations. They got to get those funds. The theory is that by less developed countries borrowing money, like a credit card, to finance their infrastructure, that it'll help them grow. So the idea is give us money to build roads so we can then get our stuff out. And then once we get our stuff out, we can pay you back. That's the theory. The problem is that many less developed countries are unable to repay the interest on their loans, let alone the principal. They're borrowing money so much that they don't make enough profit to get all those monies out. And that is part of the problem. So that is the international trade approach. That is development. Again, you want to get one. One is the way to go for Human Development Index, and you want to get more and more and more. One of the things you may wish to do to review human development, just go ahead and Google human development and Google your country and see what your country's human development is and why your human development is that way in your country. Go ahead and check that out, and I think you will find that pretty interesting. The last thing I want to talk about here is another theory, and this is from industry, and I don't want to go through all this very quickly. I just want to go through this. I'm not going to go through all of it. This is industry. This is chapter 11. It's a lot of stuff we just talked about. It's a lot of repetitive stuff, but I'll just kind of go through it really quick here to give you some stuff. One of the things that you need to know about industry is that you got to have a comparative advantage. That's kind of what we were talking about. You're always looking for a comparative advantage. What do you do better than everybody else? And ultimately, you want to try to have what's called the Ullman triad, where your good complements another good, your good is easy to use, and you are an intervening opportunity. So if you think about a complementary good, one of the best things you can do is a good that's already being produced, you try and add to something that's going to make that better. That's called complementarity. Transferability, that your good is very easy to transport. And finally, an intervening opportunity. You are trying to take business from other people. That's some of the key ideas of industry. Now, one of the big ideas, this is just industrial location. We talked about all that stuff. This is all just industry and industrialization, a lot of stuff you already know here. What I want to focus on here, though, is the this core periphery we already talked about. I'm going to leave this up here for a second, so if you want to pause it, you can go ahead and copy that down, but this is pretty all kind of self-explanatory stuff. The main thing I want to look at is something that is called, as soon as I get it over here, something that is called the industrial location theory. And the industrial location theory says, much like people grow things in certain ways, aka the von Thunen model, the industrial location theory says people make things in a certain way. And why do they make things a certain way? Well, because distance is reflected through transportation and labor costs, and that affects where it is made. So I want to show you something. I want to show you something called the Weber's least cost theory. Weber's least cost theory explains the optimal location of a manufacturing establishment in terms of three basic expenses: transportation, labor, and agglomeration, or where it's made. So if you look at the situation, that involves transportation. How far are you transporting it? Are you transporting it far? Or are you transporting it fast? Where are you transporting it? Site involves the characteristics of a location. What's the labor like? What's the market like? Here's the general rule of thumb. If the cost of transporting the product exceeds the cost of transporting the inputs, then the plant should be located closer to the market. Here's what I mean by that. Say you have a bottle of Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola, an empty bottle, is it heavier or lighter full? Of course it's heavier full. So you want to move that Coca-Cola bottle as least as possible. That is called the Weber's least cost theory. Weber's least cost theory looks like this. Here is where Weber's least cost theory is. Here's your market. Here's where your one product is. Here's where your other raw material is. So raw material 1, raw material 2, production plant, and the market. Let's take Coca-Cola. You have Coca-Cola. We know Coca-Cola is expensive to transport when you have a full bottle. So you don't want to move that full bottle. So where do you put it? Closer to where you're going to sell that Coca-Cola. That's why Coca-Cola has manufacturing plants all over the country. Let's look at something else. Let's take this desk that I'm sitting at right here. It's a heavy desk. I don't want to move it that far. True, but is the desk heavier as a tree in the middle of the woods, or is it heavier as my desk? Obviously, it's heavier as my desk. So I want to move the tree the least distance, and my desk, which is lighter, a least distance. So you're going to put that plant right over here next to where those trees are. The Weber's least cost theory says whatever's most expensive, you move least. If it's the finished product, your good should be closer to the market. If it's the product that is, if it's the raw material that's going to be heavier, then you put your production plant closer to where the raw material is. That is called the Weber's least cost theory. So things that are located near inputs or near raw materials, bulk reducing industries, steel, copper, all those types of things. Located near markets, bulk gaining industries like Coca-Cola. There's the empty bottle and the full bottle. Single market manufacturers. If you're only given one single thing, if it's only going to one place, obviously that's going to be near the market. And perishable products that are weight gainers, as a Coca-Cola bottle, or volume gainers, meaning it's gaining in size, not just weight. And that is kind of the Weber's least cost theory. Pretty basic stuff there. It's not too difficult to understand. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but I just wanted to make sure that you kind of had a little bit of an intro to it when the class goes over the review, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. With that being said, that is it for development. That is it for industry. So please take a couple minutes to review this video. You can pause it when you want. You can rewind it. Mr. Swain on demand anytime. And this is Mr. Swain signing off, saying I'll catch you down the road.